of the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on the topic Prevention of Noise-Induced Hearing Loss. Before we start, I'd just like to review a few housekeeping items. First of all, you'll be muted during the presentation. So if you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the online chat. And at the completion of the webinar, Dr. Craner will spend 5 to 10 minutes in Q&A. So we'll keep track of your questions as you enter them into the online chat. The webinar is being recorded, and we will send out a link after this webinar to everybody who registered, and it will also be available on our coehce.org website for continuing education credit. Continuing education credit is available for registered nurses and may be available for industrial hygiene credits. If you want to obtain credit, please register again at coehce.org, and you must complete the evaluation for the webinar, and then you'll be emailed your certificate of completion. So at this time, I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. James Craner. Dr. Craner is an occupational medicine physician based in Reno, Nevada. He has many years' experience in diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of occupational and environmental disease. He specializes in medical surveillance, biological monitoring, noise exposure, and audiometric interpretation, and regulatory compliance consultation, and best practices program development for hazardous, highly regulated industries in the US and other nations. He also serves as an assistant clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine, and he's author of the medical surveillance chapter in the most recent edition of the textbook, Current Occupational and Environmental Medicine. Dr. Craner is creator of WebOSCA, a web-based software system that automates and streamlines the process of managing health and safety compliance data and requirements. Dr. Craner has also kindly offered that you may contact him, and he'll provide his email at the end of this presentation if you have further questions. So at this point, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Craner.
Good morning. This morning, we're going to cover a fairly broad subject, so I will try to move quickly but comprehensively through the topics to get to the main point, which is the last point here in the learning objectives. So I'm going to first talk briefly about the importance of objectively measuring the effectiveness of hearing conservation programs and interventions. Then I'm going to turn to the standard threshold shift. This is a regulatory compliance reporting outcome, and I will discuss its limitations as a preventive medical surveillance metric. Third, I will talk about audiometric database analysis, or ADBA, the concept, methods, and the reasons why it has never been validated or adopted either by industry or regulatory agencies. And finally, I will present the patent pending best practices, methods, and tools that I have developed for summarizing and statistically analyzing audiometric data, and how that is integrated into an automated health and safety compliance information technology platform. The first information I want to present and emphasize, which I hope everybody on this webinar already recognizes, is that noise-induced hearing loss presents with a very high incidence and a very significant social, physical, and economic burden. I'm presenting United States data here, but this can be extrapolated worldwide. The numbers of affected workers in the United States who are exposed to threshold levels of noise that can cause this disease is well in the millions, estimated at 22 million. This is after a major regulation. The OSHA noise standard has been in effect 33 years, and the corresponding mining standard has been in effect nearly 20 years. This disease continues to occur at fairly high rates. The number of new cases reported is well over 100,000 over about a 7 to 8 year period, and that very likely underestimates the true number of cases. When we talk about the number of audiograms performed, it's estimated that over 20 million annually are performed at a cost of over $1 billion, with somewhere between $2 and $10 billion spent on hearing conservation programs. And I might point out those billions of dollars are received by people like me, physicians, audiologists, hearing aid manufacturers, audiometric equipment manufacturers, noise dosimeter and sound level meter companies, mobile and other testing services, consultants, and hearing protection manufacturers and distributors. So this is part of our gross domestic product. Most importantly, as I'll talk about, the preventable fraction of noise-induced hearing loss is, in theory, 100%, and the disease is 0% reversible. Those are very important statistics for how to approach this problem from a public health standpoint. The costs for workers' compensation alone in the United States are well over $240 million, and that's an old statistic, and its impact on quality of life and productivity is probably many times greater. And I might point out that significant disability costs are not borne by workers' compensation, but by Social Security and Medicare. Noise-induced hearing loss is preventable primarily and secondarily. And by that, I mean not only by controlling the exposure, but by medical monitoring, which is the focus of my presentation today. And because it's a preventable disease and a regulation exists and has existed for well over 30 years, at least in the United States, we would think that this problem has been solved or at least outlawed, and it has not. And some of the factors that affect preventability have to do with the threshold. 85 decibels, around that number, is on a continuing or recurring basis the threshold by which exposure over a period of time can result in this disease. There is a dose response based upon the amplitude of the noise and to some extent the duration, although an important fact is that the timing of onset of hearing loss is much more rapid and early than is otherwise assumed. This is a disease that develops within 5 and sometimes fewer years, and often within 10 years of employment, either in a single job or in a series of jobs or conditions in which there is this threshold of noise exposure. The progression of disease is continuous with ongoing exposure. It's mostly symmetrical, except for a few particular occupations, but rarely is this reflected in the audiometric data, which is rarely identical between both ears. As I mentioned before, the disease is irreversible. By the time detectable impairment has occurred, either through an individual saying, I can't quite hear background noise, or I'm having difficulty in conversations, or even on an audiogram, those changes are already permanent. Everybody who is exposed to a sufficient amount of noise is susceptible. No one is immune, although not everybody who is exposed gets the disease, just like many other occupational diseases. And finally, from a causation standpoint, there's no differentiation between occupational and other or previous noise exposure. Dr. Alice Suter, a very highly esteemed audiologist, stated back in the late 1980s that some noise-exposed employees are losing their hearing despite the implementation of hearing conservation programs. Employers do not know how to evaluate hearing conservation program effectiveness, and audiograms are often filed away after testing. I will get back to that quote as I get through the program and we understand where we are in relation to 1987. So if regulations are in place to prevent noise-induced hearing loss, why aren't they working as intended? My insight into this fundamental question is that noise, at least in the United States, and actually in most industrialized nations, is regulated as a safety standard, whereas it really belongs as a health standard. What's the difference? Safety is primarily specification-driven and incident-based. In theory, if a safety regulation checklist is fully and correctly implemented which is what we call compliance, regardless of the particular industry or company, an accident or injury should not occur. In contrast, health-based standards are exposure-driven but performance-based. What that means is that the requirements, which are unique to each particular company or facility, are for recurring exposure measurements, but performance is the determination of how well did the exposure control prevent the disease from developing over time. Noise-induced hearing loss is really a disease, not an injury, that occurs over time. It's progressive, and as I talked about in the previous slide, difficult to determine when it has occurred, and by the time it has occurred, it's irreversible. The features here that I discuss are not only about exposure, but in particular on audiograms. One of the most important points about the OSHA noise standard and the corresponding MSHA noise standard is that no medical interpretation of audiograms is required. Results literally can be eyeballed one at a time. The audiogram is actually not diagnosed, both either on an individual or aggregate pattern among employees over time. The determination, which I will talk about in a subsequent slide, is whether or not a standard threshold shift is present or absent at that time. And very importantly, regulators such as OSHA or MSHA or agencies such as NIOSH do not collect or audit data or calculations. So as a screening or public health test for occupational purposes, this is a fairly simple approach to prevention. Where are we now? The standard of care in 2017 in most places that I've seen, as illustrated here, is we're still largely on paper, or as you see on the right for the third audiogram on the left, still printing out audiometric results, pasting them on a piece of paper, and faxing them to the employer. Even when more sophisticated web-based tools are used, they still simply plot the results, but don't do any interpretation. And on the right of the screen, a more standard industrial audiogram that larger companies with a larger budget can afford, it basically is simply plotting what the regulation requires, which is the baseline and the current audiogram, and whether or not the standard threshold shift is present or absent in either ear. Often the industrial representative will point to a stack of audiograms saying that he hasn't the slightest idea what the reports contain or mean, and that he doesn't really know if the employees are using hearing protectors properly. This is from a major textbook of hearing conservation in 2006 and tells us how far or not we have come since Dr. Suter's statement in 1987. The reason why audiograms are difficult to interpret is because they are very complex. The data structure is actually 14 to 16 data points consisting of 7 to 8 frequencies, noise frequencies in 2 ears. That's very different than interpreting, say, a blood lead level or some other single piece of data, comparing it from point to point. The unit measurements are logarithmic in decibel units, and they're not additive. And the data scale is actually the same as the variability, 5 decibel increments. An audiogram is measured from 0 to 110 decibels, and so there is a confined range of results with no universal definition of what is normal or abnormal. Moreover, abnormal results are ranked by the peak lost at any given frequency. If an employee has a loss at 0.5 kilohertz and it is deemed moderate, then the entire hearing loss is deemed moderate. As I mentioned earlier, although most cases of noise-induced hearing loss in general industry are symmetrical, rarely is the progression of the audiogram symmetrical. The characteristic pattern of a high-frequency notch, which I'll show in a subsequent slide, occurs at the mid-stage of disease, and consequently, and the focus of my technology is that detecting this characteristic pattern at an early stage is very difficult and requires a different approach. Audiograms are highly variable and unpredictable. One cannot predict, at least with the current technology and methods, which employees will go on to have changes. And within a single company, there can be a significant variety of outcomes that occur. Very importantly, the progression of noise-induced hearing loss is small and often inconsistent year-to-year changes, going up and down or staying the same in one or more frequency. A person may have seemingly minor year-to-year changes that nonetheless result in a large overall change from baseline that is not detectable until the point where the disease has already occurred. In a disease that may have progression to irreversibility within 5 to 10 years, the somewhat arbitrary requirement of an annual audiogram may actually be too short of an interval to measure significant or incremental changes. That brings me to the standard threshold shift, commonly abbreviated as the STS. The standard threshold shift is a regulatory defined term that refers to an increase in 10 or more decibels in the average of the hearing threshold or level at 2, 3, and 4,000 kilohertz compared with baseline. It's a very simple calculation that follows that requirement. And at least in the United States, the current test average of those at those 3 frequencies must be greater than or equal to 25 decibels. Again, this is without defining what normal is, so it applies at any level of change. The purpose of the standard threshold shift is to report and count cases of hearing loss. That's really what it is. And from a preventive standpoint, in the right-hand column, because disease is conflated with injury, these are treated as the same thing. In reality, they're not, but from a regulatory standpoint, they are. What's really important to note is that the speech range of hearing that is affected is 2 kilohertz or lower, and so this threshold shift is measuring when noise-induced hearing loss impacts the beginning part of the speech range. The intent of the standard threshold shift is as an early indicator of permanent hearing loss, and that's true, but it has very low sensitivity and really is a lagging indicator. The disease is not detected in the early preventable stage, and that's particularly true in occupations and industries where the high frequency loss starts even further at a higher frequency, such as 6 kilohertz. Most noise-induced hearing loss starts at 4 kilohertz, but not always. The standard threshold shift is an enforcement tool that requires corrective action. The problem from a preventive standpoint is that by the time a so-called corrective action or reaction occurs, it's ineffective and or too late to actually prevent the disease from developing. Age adjustment is allowed to minimize the effect of age-related hearing loss. The problem with that from a preventive standpoint is that it reduces the sensitivity of the standard threshold shift to detect early noise-induced hearing loss, and it biases against older workers. In addition to the problems of sensitivity, we also have specificity issues. Because no audiometric diagnosis is required, there is a high rate of false positives from other conditions that can produce a change in the average hearing loss in the mid-high frequency range. And finally, as I have mentioned several times, very significant, a standard threshold shift can occur in either ear, and that is deemed a recordable hearing loss for purposes of regulatory compliance. But remember that noise-induced hearing loss is a bilateral process, even though each ear is treated separately. Noise is thus unique, and hearing is thus unique in that we have 2 organs that are affected with 1 person. The bottom line is that even when employers dutifully comply with the noise standard requirements, they don't have the tools or methods to objectively demonstrate the effectiveness of their preventive interventions. And that's where audiometric database analysis comes in. ADBA is a standardized, systematic method for aggregate statistical analysis of serial audiograms in individual employees. And this was developed back in the late 1980s when hearing conservation programs had already been developed at the outset of the implementation of the OSHA noise standard in the United States. hearing conservation had been going on in industrialized nations for many years. The technology, which is actually not much different than it is today, except perhaps more automated and more sensitive, was already in place. And audiologists throughout, particularly the United States, but throughout industrialized nations, recognized that they needed to actually have a method to prevent noise-induced hearing loss by identifying early trends before threshold shifts and irreversible disabling hearing loss develops in workers, and to actually have a method to objectively evaluate the overall effectiveness of hearing conservation programs among groups of workers. From an occupational medicine and public health standpoint, everybody should be saying this makes sense. Dr. Royster in 1990 wrote in the American National Standards Institute S12 document, which I will subsequently talk about, that audiograms do not prevent hearing loss, but using ADBA results can. Back in 1990, this boded well for developing this technology so that companies could actually measure the effectiveness of training their workers, providing them with hearing protection, reducing noise exposure, and justifying these millions of annual audiograms, at least in the United States, each year. So now I'm going to turn and describe what has happened between 1991, when a major national standard was developed, and 2011. The ANSI S12.13 standard is actually 4 variations of a mathematical construct that initially corporate hearing conservation programs and intended for small to medium-sized industry ultimately would use for their in-house audiograms. We now recognize that 98% to 99% of all audiograms are not performed in large corporate programs, but by small to medium industries where the vast majority of workers exposed to hazardous levels of noise actually work. But this method was developed for in-house audiograms using about 140,000 audiograms. It required that a minimum of 30 workers per company exist. And I can tell you that that alone eliminates about 2/3 of the companies where workers are exposed to hazardous noise, but nonetheless, that's where the methodology was developed. And it required a constant participation of 4 or more years. Back in the late 1980s, it wasn't uncommon for people to remain at a company for 4 or more years. Today, we know, particularly in small to medium-sized industry, that is increasingly less common. The exclusion criteria was any pre-existing hearing loss, any kind. Could be earwax or cerumen in the ears. It could be presbycusis or age-related hearing loss. It could be from chronic middle ear infection or any other medical condition. Those workers' audiograms were removed for purposes of developing this methodology. The outcome of interest was a year-to-year change in any frequency of greater than or equal to 15 decibels in either ear. Now, somebody looking at that would say, you mean that you have to have a 15 decibel jump from any audiogram to the previous year in just any frequency in order to have that particular outcome? Yes. And the metric that was developed was to say that if any such change in any frequency in either ear in any employee occurred, that was counted as a 1, and if not, it was a 0. And then the ANSI standard said what proportion of audiograms worsened according to this outcome from year to year, and what proportion were better or worse sequentially. And they deemed the criteria for those to be acceptable if it was fewer than 20% and unacceptable if fewer than 30%. The criteria here are arbitrary, and basically they're a judgment. Somebody decided that 20% was acceptable, and that's the basis for the ANSI standard using 4 different variations. As I'll talk about, the ANSI standard underwent review in 2002 and 2011. No changes were made in either year. In addition to the ANSI standard, a number of different methods, which I'm not going to focus on, as much due to time, were a notch index, a variety of Cox proportional hazard models, and a variety of other mathematical models. What transpired? The ANSI standard was studied through a variety of different investigations. I've listed 4 of the major ones that were published between 1993 and 1996 in the first 3 rows of this table. The studies used data from the ANSI database of 140,000 audiograms and other data from 82,000 workers in the US Army and another cross-sectional database of 15,000 workers, including 62,000 audiograms in a variety of industries. These publications today might not have actually been published, but by the standards back in the 1990s, they were deemed worthy of analysis. And I don't mean to critique them as not being technically adequate, but that's what was done. And the outcomes and conclusions are very significant. First, the ADERA study, which is probably the most recognized investigation of the ANSI standard, concluded that only 7% of the audiograms actually met the ADBA eligibility criteria. And remember that those eligibility criteria were the minimum of 30 workers, constant participation greater than 4 years, and no pre-existing hearing loss. There were low levels of agreement between the various ANSI procedures and the actual standard deviation of test-to-test change in each ear or in both ears. ADERA concluded in 1993 that the adoption of the ANSI standard as a national standard was not warranted. Subsequently, the study by Simpson came out, and that study similarly recognized that the 15 decibel change criterion at any frequency significantly biased the outcomes in both directions. That is, it tended to have a lot of false positives and a lot of false negatives. As I mentioned, 15 decibels from a physiological standpoint is very unusual to occur in noise-induced hearing loss. Probably it does occur in people in the loudest occupations, but in most cases, the progression is much slower and more variable, as I described. Finally, the studies that went together in 1995 and 96 by Amos and Prince, respectively, looking at a cross-section of 15,000 workers, found significant heterogeneity among the different databases. That is, that the ADBA standard taken from large corporate databases really didn't apply to smaller workforces, and the pre-existing hearing loss, when it was actually included, which is something that's significant and real, as I mentioned, there is a lot of hearing loss in the general population, not just due to noise, although noise accounts for about 16%, confounded the sensitivity of the threshold that the ANSI standard defined. In 2002, the ANSI committee itself actually rejected the adoption of its own standard. This was big. They cited the lack of sensitivity and specificity and the inability of employers to both implement it and to ensure that the database was correct and complete. Nothing really developed for about 10 years, and in 2011, the ANSI committee proposed no changes and actually did no further research or produced any additional publications to support its methodology. During that time period, there were a total of about 2,500 studies that were conducted on audiometric data and progression. A 2014 Cochrane review, and Cochrane is the volunteer organization that is involved with analysis of data quality for evidence-based medicine, actually reviewed these studies and found that only 19 met the inclusion criteria. And their conclusion from this study was that very low quality evidence from using hearing protective devices in well-implemented hearing conservation programs is associated with a reduction in hearing loss. What does all of that mean? It means that after literally 25 years now, not only is a tool or method to substantiate and measure the effectiveness of all these audiograms available, but there's actually very little evidence that shows that wearing hearing protective devices, even in a otherwise well-conducted hearing conservation program, is actually effective at preventing the disease, which, as I discussed, is the point of health-based standards, although it's not really the purpose of a safety-based standard. That brings us to state-of-the-art last year, when I actually got very involved in this. My impetus for getting involved with this subject, which I'll talk about in the next slide, actually came about 5 years ago when I became immersed in this topic and realized that there were no really good tools or methods. But after 3 decades of satisfying the minimum noise standard requirements for audiometry and the concurrent production of millions of audiograms, companies still do not effectively utilize their audiometric data to prevent noise-induced hearing loss. Dr. Suter, who I quoted from 1987, 21 years later stated that we know that many more workers are having their hearing tested, but the fundamental questions of whether or not the incidence and prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss is decreasing is yet to be answered. And as this slide shows, every entity that has a stake in this, the entities that basically are receiving the billions of dollars being spent, from government agencies to occupational medicine and occupational nursing and hearing, to public health, labor and standards organizations, audiologists, the hearing protection manufacturers, the audiometer manufacturers and distributors, the companies that provide these services, such as audiometry and occupational health, the companies that manage the data or provide tools to manage the data, and even the companies that manage the risk in the case of workers' compensation. None of them has developed tools or methods to measure aggregate trends or hearing conservation program effectiveness. Even with the widespread use of computerization and the availability of databases, internet, and automated technology over the past 20+ years, and as I mentioned, billions of dollars, now tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in audiograms and related hearing conservation compliance, no significant advances beyond the minimum of OSHA record keeping and one-at-a-time audiometric usage and standard threshold shifts has actually been implemented. I may point out that my own organization, the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, has actually issued 2 evidence-based statements for best practices and proficiency in early detection and prevention of occupational hearing loss in 2003 and 2012. Neither of these statements includes any recommendations or guidance beyond individual audiogram interpretation or action outside the scope of the OSHA noise standard. So that tells you that even the organizations with the most vested interest from a professional as well as financial standpoint in screening audiometry for noise-induced hearing loss prevention have not addressed this subject. What is the state of the art? It basically constitutes regulatory compliance. That is de minimis compliance, fulfilling the minimum requirements of the OSHA or MSHA noise standard or the corresponding standards in other countries has become the de facto best practices. Companies collect the required audiograms and report the standard threshold shifts, but they don't effectively use this data to prevent noise-induced hearing loss or measure the effectiveness of their hearing conservation programs. Because of that, there is a significant gap in public health and methodological approach to audiometric data. And that brings me to the final part of my presentation and the crux. I've spent a lot of time explaining the foundation of how and why we have gotten to this point. And now the part that I want to describe is my realization and understanding of this problem. How did I get here? For me, as an occupational medicine physician whose career has focused largely on chemical and physical exposures, The challenge of effectively preventing occupational disease beyond minimum regulatory compliance and the need to move occupational health and safety from one worker at a time to a public health population-based approach was my impetus to develop tools and methods and technology to solve this problem. And for noise, what I have developed is a system that has two parts. The first and second part listed here is a data management system. Companies need more than spreadsheets and paper files and folders to manage the complex, dynamic, interrelated data that is at the core of health and safety compliance. And that's what my software called WebOscar does. It automates and streamlines that process, and that has been in use in 2011 and was developed by myself and supported by an expert team. Just briefly to mention, that includes a software architect, a PhD statistician, audiologist, certified industrial hygienist, and an OSHA compliance specialist. The part that's relevant to noise is the metric and statistics that we have developed to mathematically transform raw audiometric data into a single numerical value, which we call the dBW. You can see what the W stands for, and that is a provisional patent or patent pending methodology that we're going to be rolling into this software platform this year and helping companies actually really do something with their audiometric data. What this metric does is statistically quantifies the magnitude and direction of noise-induced hearing loss trend over time in individuals and groups so that both outcomes and performance basically conform to a health-based standard, thereby transforming the original intent of the regulation of noise as a safety standard truly into a preventive tool for noise-induced hearing loss as a disease, which is what it really is. Let me elaborate on what the dBW metric is. Now, I cannot tell you exactly what it is, not because I can't, but because I won't, because it's patent pending, but it's actually built into the platform. Let me describe what it can do. Up here, you see, this is a very simplified example of the progression of noise-induced hearing loss audiometrically in an individual. And here, by contrast, is presbycusis, or age-related hearing loss. A variety of different causes of hearing loss, including normal fluctuation, exist, and that's presented as a correlation on the lower histogram. What the dBW metric does is it provides a way to differentiate other patterns from that of noise-induced hearing loss so that visually, particularly in the early stages, they are differentiated. And that's shown here in the middle slide, where you see the blue line representing presbycusis and the red line representing noise-induced hearing loss. Some of the important attributes that help make this not only sensitive and specific, but easy to use when the automated system is doing all of the very complex math, is that it provides both sensitivity and specificity, which, as I described, the S12 ANSI, the ANSI S12 standard really did not. So it is intended to be able to detect noise-induced hearing loss at its earliest stage and differentiate it from other prevalent noise-induced or hearing loss conditions. It's actually expressed in decibel units, and it's not reliant upon an arbitrary threshold like the standard threshold shift. It is not affected by abnormal baseline tests, which means that if somebody has pre-existing hearing loss, this metric will not be biased toward or against detection of a trend toward noise-induced hearing loss or conversely, a false negative. The test-to-test variability that normally exists in an audiogram, which, as I mentioned, is the same interval as the actual unit of measurement, 5 decibel. That's what's called the signal-to-noise ratio, is minimized. It does not require control data, which the ANSI standard did not either. And it measures changes in either or both ears. It can be used with small numbers of employees with a variable number of serial audiograms, and does not require a minimum number of tests or assume a normal distribution of data. So it is really doing a lot to filter out the background and help employers detect noise-induced hearing loss early and potentially intervene. And it then is also statistically analyzed so that the measurements among a group can be assessed from year to year to determine to what extent actual hearing loss is occurring before the standard threshold shifts occur, which was the original purpose of the ANSI standard and the goals that Dr. Suter and Dr. Royster and others had intended back in the late 1980s. This histogram demonstrates the overall intent of the DBW methodology and statistical analysis. It's taking non-continuous data, as I've described, in a variety of different populations, of variable duration and number of tests relative to the 1-year frequency of tests, and it is doing a mathematical transformation whereby the actual results are then put through sensitivity analysis or receiver operator curves, essentially, to distinguish when noise-induced hearing loss is likely to be present as a cutoff. Here it's somewhat arbitrarily listed as a value of about 14, but this is for demonstration purposes. And the idea or concept is that this is being detected long before the disease presents, much like a screening test for blood lead is intended to assess relative internal exposure or toxicity before the irreversible health effects occur, or any type of biological test, whether it's a PSA for prostate cancer, which, as many of you know, has a lot of problems with false positives, or any other type of health screening measure, such as a blood cholesterol or serum cholesterol for measuring risk for heart disease. This actually interprets the trend toward noise-induced hearing loss without requiring or changing the requirement that a qualified person actually has to interpret an audiogram, although that I think is something that's still important, and it handles outliers and missing data. The reason that this mathematical construct was developed was to be simple and easy to use and to be able to allow real-time data to and from an information management system without the user having to do complex calculations. I can tell you that in reality, the way that I got involved with noise-induced hearing loss was employers coming to me saying that the local industrial clinic that they were using with those handwritten audiograms wasn't calculating the standard threshold shift correctly, either at all or wasn't doing it right, and they questioned whether or not employees had recordable hearing loss. That remains the state-of-the-art problem today. So you can imagine that many employers who are still managing audiometric data in this crude way aren't going to be in a position to do what I'm describing here without a method to manage the data. And that is what the automated data management system called WebOscar does. This is designed to be a robust system that will integrate, and it now does to some extent and is continuing to do so, with other health, safety, environmental, and HR applications. It is designed to be very accurate using business rules and logic that eliminates the errors, oversights, omissions, duplications, loss of data that is so commonplace in regulatory compliance in the real world. It's configurable so that each company is using this platform in its own way, to specifying the requirements of the particular departments, jobs, shifts, and compliance requirements for that particular facility or organization. It manages data in a real-time method, as I'm showing here, with dashboards and other tools to dynamically generate and update information as it's fed in. It's secure, expert-driven, so that somebody who is the shift manager or the branch manager or a safety officer with no real background, let's say in health or in biostatistics, can actually use this not only to manage noise, but respirators, chemicals, training, and all the requirements that companies have. It's designed to be affordable. It's intended to be easy and fast and to integrate with their current system. Let me conclude by talking about the applications of this technology. This presentation today actually was constituted by my submission to the very first of its kind OSHA NIOSH Safety Challenge Technology Conference that was held in 2016 in Washington, D.C. This OSHA challenge went out for the first time. Instead of OSHA saying we're going to develop tools and technology that industry could use, which as you can see for noise is somewhat limited, and OSHA and NIOSH said we're going to go out to the world and find the best technology. And they were searching for agile, innovative solutions for significant occupational health and safety challenges. And the first one that they picked was noise, because it is such a long-standing and significant problem from a burden standpoint, as I talked about, not only economically, but from a health standpoint. And this was one of the 10 finalists. If you're interested in reading about that, I've included a link to the blog. What am I going to be doing, myself and my team, in 2017? We are implementing what I presented here today in real databases. We've actually already tested it methodologically and know it works. The actual patent will be coming out, and we are in the process of submitting peer review publication for justification and needs, and then ongoing publication of results after they come in. In summary, I am confident that this really represents a breakthrough in one of the most important, and I think somewhat ignored, occupational health and safety problems that exist throughout the world today. And I am very excited to be a part of transforming that and doing it in a way that helps businesses not only protect their workers' health, but makes them more productive and efficient.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Dr. Craner. And we have some time now for Q&A. We have a couple of questions already. And please, if you have any further questions, enter them into the Q&A or the chat and we can ask Dr. Craner. So first of all, one person had asked, could you discuss the potential use of acoustic emissions testing in the role of hearing conservation programs?
I'll be glad to. I think autoacoustic emissions testing involves a way to put a device in an ear and measure hearing without having to go to a booth and conduct a standard audiogram. There were actually two technologies presented at the OSHA NIOSH Noise Safety Challenge that addressed that to some extent. It appears to have a lot of potential, but as we know, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere, regulations are very slow in being changed, and technology, although it's coming out very quickly, is very slow to be adapted. I think that autoacoustic emissions testing will have a bigger role outside the occupational setting where, for example, people exposed to loud music or people with other conditions could be tested in a more efficient and cost-effective manner. I think it's going to have to be proven or at least demonstrated more effective in that realm in order to gain the type of mass acceptance that it might need from a regulatory compliance standpoint.
Another question, which I was great to hear in your presentation, the value of managing the data for helping prevent noise-induced hearing loss, but somebody also asked if you had other suggestions for noise-induced hearing loss prevention.
The methods that are needed to primarily prevent noise-induced hearing loss, which involve reduction of the primary hazard, really are widely available. I think that that issue has been largely addressed. It's still an issue in many industries. I take care of employees who work in inherently loud industries where as much engineering as can be done has already been done. They're just simply loud due to mechanical action. So there's really nothing further that can be done in some industries. And most more modern industries are being engineered to minimize the noise hazard, just like they're being designed to minimize chemical and other physical hazards as well. That still relies upon an industry by industry approach. The real solution, in my opinion, is secondary prevention. And by that, I mean that once a company or an industry has maximally effected its primary prevention, it needs to then, through hearing conservation, through earplugs and other methods, through training, and through these audiograms, intervene to prevent the problem. And it's a really expensive problem, so they have skin in the game. But in order to do that, they're going to have to buy in, I think, to a different approach to health and safety, compliance, and data management altogether. Those are my two major recommendations, and I think that in the end, it's going to reduce the burden of disease. It's never going to completely eliminate it, but to make it a much more manageable problem, particularly from a public health standpoint.
Another question somebody asked is whether WebOSCA can be utilized in conjunction with other electronic medical record systems.
That's a good question. That is the plan. WebOSCA has been designed from the outset to be a tool that employers can utilize. The new parts of WebOSCA that are coming out will provide portals for other entities, including medical providers, to use. Those familiar with electronic health records know that those systems are very disparate in their functionality and often don't have application outside of hospital or typical medical care settings. What we are designing is an interface that will allow that to occur, where the employer, who is primarily responsible for protecting the health of the employees, can interact with that in a meaningful way and allow from a financial standpoint, to allow the correct data to flow in and potentially flow out without losing control on costs, which, as we all know, is the major issue in business and industry today, which is healthcare costs in general, and particularly the costs of medical or disease care.
Does the program produce output that's easy to understand and that can be used to help train and motivate workers?
Yes. What WebOSCA is really designed to do is what my training as an occupational medicine physician was, I think, intended to fulfill, which is to address occupational medicine, occupational health of workers on an aggregate or public health basis as well as an individual basis. One of the reasons why I think screening audiometry has never been effective is because it has been limited, as I presented it here, to a one-at-a-time approach. What did my audiogram show? What is my hearing loss? Becomes the result that workers receive. They're not told how effective hearing conservation is in the company or in the industry or by the particular process. One of the largest companies in the world that I think is transforming the way that manufacturing is done is an example where they're taking the approach of saying what needs to be done to protect workers as a whole, and how do we apply that to the individual level. I think that's where the real buy-in will occur, when everybody understands that everybody is affected and that the prevention of this problem benefits not only the individual worker, but the entity as a whole, and then it gives people a stake in the outcome. To answer your question about easy to understand, it has to be something that somebody can see in a simple graphic with a pre-calculated point and a cutoff that is explained in an easy to understand way. Otherwise, companies will be, in a sense, held hostage to either the government agencies, or experts, such as someone like myself, having to do that for them, which they don't want to do. The OSHA and MSHA noise standards clearly don't identify specialists as being required. And even though quite a few companies have audiologists or occupational medicine physicians or general physicians interpreting these audiograms, it's not systematically done because it's too expensive for them.
You mentioned you were a finalist in the OSHA NIOSH Here and Now Noise Challenge. Could you say what some of the other contestants had focused on?
I was pleasantly surprised to find out that the technology that I just presented was the only technology that actually dealt with information that was already collected and already in place. So it was technology designed to evaluate data. And the other 9 finalists addressed primarily things that can go in the ear to prevent noise-induced hearing loss or communicate. And so they were more primary and secondary preventive tools. They did not deal with audiometric data. In that regard, this was a fairly unique approach to looking at audiometry as opposed to looking at noise and reducing the hazard.
Great. Well, if there's any more questions for Dr. Craner, otherwise we can just say thank you to our speaker and to everybody for attending today. Again, it's really nice to have contact information for Dr. Craner if you have any further questions to reach out to him. And as I mentioned before, this is recorded and we will send out the link to everyone who registered for this webinar, and it's also available, will be available on our website, which is coehce.org for continuing education credit. We hope that we can find a time in the future for Dr. Craner to present in person in our northern California, Nevada area somewhere. So stay tuned and we'll update you when we can confirm that. It would be very nice to be able to hear more from him. Our monthly webinar series does take place on the first Wednesday of each month at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. So next month on Wednesday, July 5th, we're honored to welcome Christy Sullivan, who's going to present on the topic of non-animal occupational toxicology testing, technology and policy. So we will send out information about that. And again, thank you very, very much to our speaker today and to everyone who attended. Thank you.